So we'll be speaking to you about React Suspense. Not an intentional kind of transition with Ben just talking about Suspense up here, but it definitely leads in nicely. And we'll be talking about some of the superpowers, some of the capabilities that are possible if you combine React Suspense with GraphQL.
Yeah, so first, let's introduce ourselves. So I'm Jerel Miller. I am a principal software engineer at Apollo, working as a core maintainer on Apollo Client.
And my name is Alessia Bellisario. I'm a staff software engineer also at Apollo, also working on Apollo Client. And for those who may not be familiar, Apollo Client is a library that allows you to fetch data from your favorite GraphQL APIs, cache it in the browser, minimize network requests, and build performant apps.
Yeah, awesome. So again, let's talk a little bit about what we're going to be looking at today. So we're going to be talking about building apps with React Suspense and GraphQL using Apollo Client. And we're going to explore how we can combine these technologies and using their APIs to build just really great user experiences.
Yeah, so we're going to start with what this talk will be about. So first, we'll just cover some general concepts to introduce or reintroduce React Suspense to y'all. We'll be focusing on client-rendered apps today, and then we're going to go into a live coding section where we'll do a demo of a Spotify clone that we've built to show off Apollo Client's new data fetching hooks with Suspense support that we released just last week in Apollo Client version 3.8.
And also importantly, let's talk about what we're not going to talk about today. React Server Components. Thank you, Ben, for giving us that demo, because we unfortunately don't have enough time to talk about that. But for those of you that do use Apollo Client, we did release an experimental package for Next.js that does handle some of the React Server Components integration with Apollo. So shout out to our co-maintainer, Lens, who's put a lot of time and effort into getting this package up and running for you. Also, we're not going to be talking about how to implement Suspense support in a data fetching library, because trust us, it's actually a little more complicated than meets the eye.
Okay, so now we're just going to go back in time for a minute to 2018. We're going to be the second presenters today to feature an Andrew Clark talk. Shout out to Tejas' talk earlier. So Andrew Clark, currently at Vercel, React core team member. And I really like this tweet because, for one thing, I think it's useful to go back to this era in web development. Only 5 years ago, January 2018, this is more than a month before Dan Abramov will deliver his JSConf Iceland talk Beyond React 16, which introduced some of the first public demos of Suspense features. And I really liked this, the way that Andrew Clark kind of phrased this when he wrote, "One reason iOS feels so much nicer than the web, fewer unnecessary loading states." And in the video here, we see what happens when you tap in Options in the Settings app. Instead of transitioning immediately and showing a flash of a spinner, the operating system just pauses for a moment to prepare the view, and then it slides over really naturally and fluidly. And it's that imperceptible pause while the view's being prepared that makes this such a nice experience. And so I think this is a good reminder of, like, just even 5 years ago, the tools that we were sort of lacking as web developers to build an experience this fluid as the one we see here on iOS.
Yeah. So we're going to be talking about this in the context of Apollo. So for those of you that have used Apollo, you're used to building your apps with our useQuery hook, which is a hook that lets you fetch some data. It exports a loading Boolean, which you presumably use to show some loading UI. But we're going to take a look at a little bit of a simplistic example here that uses useQuery to kind of get an idea of how apps are built today.
Yeah, so if you're not familiar with useQuery or an equivalent hook, this is a simple example. We have an app that renders a button. When you click the button, we're rendering our albums component here, which is taking our get albums query that you see at the top of the file, which is fetching a list of albums. And for each album, we're getting their ID, the year that they were put out, and the title. And then the hook returns the data, a property there, and also a loading Boolean. So we can use that loading Boolean to show our fallback UI, our loading spinner. But once we have our data, we can just map over the albums and render the list there. So this is, how many of us have been building apps for a long time, right?
Yeah. So we're going to take a look at a similar example, but this one actually uses Suspense to load the same thing. Now this one isn't integrated with Apollo client. It's actually taken straight out of the React documentation. But let's take a look at this a little bit more in depth here. So you can see that we've got a little bit different structure in our code here. One is that we've got this suspense boundary around this albums component. The suspense boundary, when I say that, is just that suspense component you see around albums there. It takes a single prop called fallback, which is the loading UI that you're going to show while the albums component is suspended. So if we take a look at the video here, you're going to see that the UX is more or less the same as we last saw. The timeout is maybe just a little bit different, but more or less it's the same. So, but our code is structured different. So let's actually take a little bit closer look at that albums component there to kind of explore some of the pieces at play here. And that's actually a lot more code than I expected to see for such a, what we would consider a simple component. So let's actually break down each of these just a little more in depth and take a look at them. So here we have that albums component, and there's a couple things to note here. One is this call to this fetch data function, which presumably goes and executes a network request at some endpoint, and then its return value is passed to this use function. So what is this use function, you might ask? It's actually a new hook that's going to be released in some future stable version of React, but currently not quite yet available. It's available in an experimental version, I believe the Canary series that were just announced not too long ago. Also, an opinionated framework such as Next.js has this available to use. But let's actually take a look at the implementation of use in this example, again, straight from the React docs.
Yeah, and here we see, still in our albums.js file, the inlined implementation of use. So again, if you're using a framework like Next.js that's using an experimental build of React under the hood, this is available. But the comment here tells us that this implementation was inlined in this file as a workaround for a bug to get the demo running. Yeah, we've all been there. Earlier we did tell you, we promised we wouldn't go into all the details of implementing Suspense support for a data fetching library, but we're making an exception here. Because this is a demo from the React docs, and it's, I think, useful to understand what use is doing here under the hood. And you'll see that line that is underlined in that condition that says if promise.status equals pending, throw promise. This is really the core mechanism of Suspense here. So, if we have an in-flight network request, then our use hook or our data fetching hook, as we'll show you now, is going to throw that promise under the hood. That's going to trigger the suspense boundary to show that loading fallback. And so this is not so different from how we're doing it in Apollo client. We're using the exact same mechanism, as Jerel will show you.
Yeah, so and just to prove to you, this is actually taken straight out of the Apollo client code base. In fact, if you were to visit that link at the bottom, you'd see pretty much exactly this. So it's our, I guess you could call it a polyfill for use at this point, but something to notice here is that it looks pretty similar to what you just saw, minus the fact that we've got this wrap promise with state, which takes care of some of the things you saw in that last slide. But also too, if you do happen to be using a version of React that does support that use hook, then we'll use that instead. We'll prefer that. Otherwise, we'll use our custom polyfill use.
And you might be wondering, why is Apollo client able to, only last week and now in 2023, add support for data fetching with Suspense? And it's a bit of a longer, more complicated answer, but I think the short answer is related to this line in the React docs here. So this line that says, the requirements for implementing a Suspense-enabled data source are unstable and undocumented. And I think we all know those are scary words for software engineers.
So thankfully, we've been working with the React core team and other open source maintainers over the course of the last 10 months or so to really kind of help us move this forward. So first of all, we want to thank them for all of their help to help us get to where we are today. And also for all of you that helped us try out our pre-release versions and give us comments and feedback on some of that. Also, Andrew Clark told us it was okay, so So we did it.
Yeah. And one final note before we jump into the live coding. So we are going to be talking a lot about loading states, but if your takeaway, like we hope that your takeaway is not that Suspense is just a different way to show a loading fallback, because I think that would miss the value prop of Suspense entirely. It's about a lot more than just showing loading fallbacks. It's really about the tools that we can use as developers to orchestrate and coordinate these transitions and state updates in our applications so that we can hopefully achieve that North Star of that really smooth transition that we saw in iOS to just ship really, really solid user experiences and avoid those flashes of spinners or inconsistent updates across our apps.
Yeah.
Yep.
So how do we take advantage of this for those of you that use Apollo Client? So as of last week, we introduced a new hook in our 3.8 release called Use Suspense Query that you can use to start executing your queries and suspending your components to get this nice UX. But what is Use Suspense Query? Essentially, it's a suspenseful use query that fetches some data that's integrated with the React 18 suspense, including React 18 transitions, which we'll touch on a little bit later here. So for the majority of the rest of our talk here, we're going to be talking about this in the context of a Spotify clone that we built to really kind of test out some of these suspense ideas and getting an idea of how this works and how we can convert these use query components over to suspense-enabled components. A couple things to point out here. So we've got these various sections in our application here that are responsible for loading some data in the app. So each of these colored sections, the colors aren't super important. They're really just a way to distinguish the various areas in this app. But again, each of these colored areas represent a component that fetches some data using useQuery. But what might this look like today using useQuery in terms of the loading UX, loading this page? So let's take a look at this.
Yeah, so here you can see the 4 areas. The first to pop in was the user menu in the top right, and then the sidebar, the play bar, the route component. So these 4 components are fetching data with useQuery, and again, that highlighting effect that we've overlaid is just to make it super obvious when a component is in a loading state. So it's kind of noisy visually. Different components are rendering, and at different times we have this kind of popcorn effect. Not the best loading UX, I would say, to start with. So let's try to improve this.
Yeah, so let's write some code together. We're actually going to work on this app, and we are going to, gotta love conference Wi-Fi, starting out with the oops page. I'm actually going to play some stuff so we don't just see a blank play bar there at the bottom, but let's go and refresh. And again, just to show, this is our app running with those loading states in mind here. So let's go and make it full screen. We're first going to start and convert this user menu component. That's that top right corner, and if you're paying attention to the colors, that's that green box you see. And we're going to go ahead and convert this to use suspense query. Something I also want to point out before we get too far, you'll notice in my query down here, I've got this @synthetics, which is a directive that just allows us to better control the timing of some of these fields, just so we can really explore these ideas a lot more in depth. So with that, let's get started converting this. I'm going to come up here to my useQuery import from Apollo Client, and I'm going to just replace this with use suspense query. Let's go ahead and update the usage here. And is it cut off for everybody else here? Okay, apparently it is. Hang on, let me make sure we can see it all. There we go. Okay, much better. So one of the things you can see just with that change there is that we get a complaint from TypeScript here, which is that loading Boolean that we're used to using with useQuery is actually not a property that's exported anymore. So again, because of the mechanisms of suspense, we don't actually need this. To work with the suspense, we're just going to come in here and actually delete that. And something else I want to point out here that's kind of interesting, if you take a look at the type of this data property, it's actually our query type. There's no undefined anymore. So you can treat this like synchronous code, which is really, really cool. But with that change, let's actually see what that did with our application. So I'm going to come over here and let's refresh it.
Okay, so we saw a black screen at first, And that was the main difference that we saw. And that just came from introducing that useSuspense query call without a suspense boundary. So I'll ask you to pay attention in the top right corner, and Joe, refresh one more time.
Absolutely.
So we can see that the first time it loads is after our user menu has received data. And so, yeah, we definitely want to introduce a suspense boundary here so we can show a fallback instead of that blank screen at first. So let's go ahead and do that.
All right, so let's go back to our code. And here's our layout component. So this should look familiar. Those key areas that we talked about earlier, the sidebar, the user menu, our playlist route, that route component there, along with our play bar, are the areas responsible for loading. But we're going to start with a user menu here. So to convert and add a suspense boundary, I'm going to import suspense from React. And then we're just going to wrap that here. And then we also want to show a fallback. So I'm going to use the user menu's loading state here to do so. So let's go and see with just that one change here what that did to our application.
Okay, and we saw the green box highlighting, again, the fact that now we are showing a loading state for the user menu. We're back to square one. Same popcorn effect. We haven't really fixed the UX yet, but now one of our components is rendering its fallback UI with suspense instead of rendering it by itself via the what it's returning. So let's add suspense boundaries around the other three components.
That sounds great. So we'll just go ahead and start with the sidebar here. Again, we're going to replace the import to use query with use suspense query. Let's update my usage here. I don't need the loading boolean anymore, or need that conditional for the loading state. Let's do the same thing for the play bar. Use suspense query. Update this. Hopefully you're starting to see a pattern here. And something to point out with this is that when we were designing use suspense query, we wanted it to feel really familiar to use query. So it has a very, very, very similar API. And for the most part, if you're using it in this way, it can be a replacement as simple as this. But let's go and do the last one here, our playlist route. Awesome. And just like we did with the user menu, we're also going to add suspense boundaries around each one of these, just because we don't want to see that blank screen again. So I'm just going to start a little copy pasta, and let's make sure we're using the right loading states for each one of these. So we want the route loading state here and the play bar loading state here. Cool. All right, and with that, let's go refresh and see what happens.
Let's see what we have. Okay, so same UX. We still haven't fixed anything yet. Pretty anticlimactic, but we're going to change some stuff very soon, okay? I think the important thing to note here is that suspense itself is not just a magic wand that you can wave. So by having 4 distinct suspense boundaries around our 4 components that are each showing a fallback here, we have not changed the user experience at all, right? We've just changed the mechanism we're using to show that loading fallback. But suspense now gives us this superpower because the whole point of suspense is that we now have this composable way of changing the way those transitions happen and the way that the user experience, ultimately feels. So let's do something drastic. Let's put one suspense boundary around our whole application and get rid of all these more granular boundaries around each individual component.
Yeah, that sounds great. So again, a little copy pasta here. I'm going to wrap around the whole thing. We'll make sure we're using the right loading state here. And I'm just going to go through and delete these individual suspense boundaries for each one of these here. Let's go ahead and save that. And now we're going to start to see some of the power of suspense and what it gives us here. So let's go ahead and refresh and see what that change did.
Much better. Just a single update to the screen. Gerald, why don't we turn off the artificial highlighting feature that we built into this demo here so we can really bask in the work that we've just done. We can sort of go home for the day, say all right, we fixed the loading UX. Yeah, let's call it a day. But maybe we're actually tired of listening to the Jaws theme at React Rally. We've had enough musical suspense. So let's go to a different playlist and see what happens, Gerald.
Yeah, sounds great. My daughter would be psyched if all of us together were to listen to her playlist. So we're going to navigate to that and Uh-oh, my loading state for the entire application just displayed again here. So.
Yeah, so we fixed the initial loading experience, but now when we change routes, our route component is fetching some new data with that use suspense query hook, which is throwing a promise under the hood when it does that network request. And so because we just have a single suspense boundary around the whole app, we lose our application shell state, that persistent UI that we want to keep on the screen, and just all of our components are resuspending. So yeah, that's definitely something that we need to fix. So let's add a second suspense boundary around our route component so that we can avoid losing our application state.
Awesome. So yeah, again, like we did before, let's just re-enable that route component there, reload our page, and let's see what happens. So now when we navigate back to the React Rally playlist, much better.
Yeah, so we fixed that navigation problem, but you hopefully noticed, and Jerel, if you can refresh again, just so we can see that we have 2 updates to the screen now on initial load. So we have that first update when the application shell unsuspends, and now that there's a second suspense boundary around our route component, we have a second update. So we've introduced a trade-off here, right? We have a little bit more happening visually on first load, but it's the right trade-off for our app because we definitely want that application shell sticking around as users click around our app. Yeah, so I think it's the right trade-off.
Absolutely. But you might ask, like, what happens if that playlist route actually loads a little bit faster than our application shell? So let's go explore what that looks like here. So here in the playlist, again, like I mentioned earlier, we have those synthetic timeouts in some of our fields. I'm just going to delete the one here for the playlist that's slowing that one down. And let's go and refresh the page and see now what that looks like.
Okay, so we're back to a single update. And this is also the power of suspense here because we see that if our inner route component is ready at the same time as the outer components in our app, suspense is going to make sure that those updates are coordinated in the way they're presented to the user. So we're never going to see the route component first. We're never going to see 2 updates within a few hundred milliseconds in a super janky way. React and Suspense is able to orchestrate that so that now in the best case scenario we have 1 update to the screen, and in the worst case scenario we have 2. So again, these trade-offs are really a part of deciding where to place your suspense boundaries in your app.
Yeah. So now, of course, in a real application, you're never going to be working with synthetic timeouts like this. It'd be a horrible user experience to ship that to your users. So we're gonna turn this off. For each of these components, let's go to play bar here. Same kind of thing. I'm just going to delete that directive here. Just so we can now see that shell is loading much faster, and this is typically what we'd expect. But something to pay attention to, again, like we're talking about that trade-off with the 2 updates to the screen. If I refresh, that playlist route is still a little bit too, loading a little bit too long for my comfort. So it wouldn't be a GraphQL talk without looking at GraphQL to see how GraphQL might be able to help us here. So there's some exciting new developments in the GraphQL specification. It's not quite in the spec yet, but still being iterated on. There's a new directive being introduced called defer, which allows you to mark a field or a part of your query subtree basically as a deferred field. So it basically just says, hey, give me whatever data you can quickly up front. I'm okay waiting for this other data. Go and stream it into me a little bit later. So let's go and see what we can do using defer to maybe make this user experience a little bit better. Because really, I'm okay waiting for those tracks to load. I want to see the playlist details as quickly as I can. So I'm going to come in here, and I'm going to just add this defer directive. And defer, you can see I'm using an inline fragment here. Presumably, we've done some work to identify that, hey, track component is the thing that's taking a long time to load here, and that's really what's slowing this thing down. No surprise to the keen eye. We got another synthetic timeout there, but just with that update, let's go and see what this does to our application here. So I'm going to go ahead and refresh.
Yep, and here we can see that we got our playlist details rendered to the screen at the same time as our application shell. So we're able to just read some information about the playlist a lot more quickly. And by deferring those tracks, we've introduced a new loading fallback just for the tracks in our playlist. And so we have another loading state here, another trade-off that we're having to make decisions about. So here we have 2 updates to the screen, but what happens if our playlist details are a little bit slower, for any of a number of reasons, right? Here we'll use our trusty synthetics directive to just see what this feels like. Okay, and now we're up to 3 updates to the screen, so that if our API call to grab the details is just a little bit slow enough that React can't batch that update with the application shell when it unsuspends. In the worst case now, we're going to have 3 updates to the screen. If our playlist details are super fast, then React will make sure that that's only 2 updates. So by introducing another loading state, we can show more things to the user earlier. We can have the page be interactive and providing more value earlier. But again, with more updates, it's more visual noise, just another thing to think about here. So that looks great. But what if we want to load in some more tracks?
Yeah, it's a great idea. Before I do that, I'm going to just remove these synthetics directives. We don't care about them anymore. We don't want to slow this down, especially as we load more tracks. Who wants to wait 2 seconds to see more of my tracks here? So let's go and scroll down, because it wouldn't be a playlist unless I could listen to something at the bottom here. And as I scroll, well, that's not great. We just got rid of our tracks list, and now we're seeing our loading fallback again.
Yeah, so something that we're definitely going to want to go in and fix, and just to give you a sense of why we're seeing the loading fallback again here, it's because in Apollo Client, our use suspense query hook provides a fetch more function and also refetch to either refetch your data or to do pagination with fetch more. And again, with that underlying network request, that's going to tell React that we need to resuspend the component because there's a network request happening. But luckily, React gives us some APIs for this, primarily start transition. So we're going to pull that in now and mark this call to fetch more as a transition. And this just tells React that we want to keep our existing UI on the screen as our component is preparing to update.
So to do so, we're just going to pull in the start transition function from React. And I'm going to come down here. Again, you saw this highlighted just a moment ago, that handle load more function here is really responsible for getting the next page of data, in this case more tracks as I scroll down. I'm going to wrap that in this call to start transition. This is where we can start to see the power of concurrent React and where we're going to start seeing it, because this doesn't actually prevent, fetch more is not prevented from suspending, it just does it in the background, which is really cool. So again, marking this as a transition by wrapping fetch more with start transition. Let's go and see what we've got here. So let's go ahead and scroll down. And that's exactly what we want there.
Yeah, much better. So we're 2 minutes over time, but that is the end of our demo. So what have we seen here today? We have started with an application using use query hooks that do not have suspense support, but we added suspense support with use suspense query. We then added our suspense boundaries and saw how moving them around can fundamentally change the user experience. We then added the defer directive to deprioritize the tracks on our playlist page and have them load in later, adding another loading fallback. And then we implemented infinite scroll with fetch more, and we learned a bit about transitions in React and how we can tell React to keep our UI on the screen while it's preparing what to show next. So thanks for going along on that live coding journey with us. And a round of applause for Jerel, because that was awesome. Yeah.
Thank you. So unfortunately, we don't have unlimited time. There is more to the Suspense story that we released in Apollo Client 3.8 that we didn't get to touch on today. So one of these is avoiding request waterfalls with use background query. So this is a hook that will start fetching and return a query ref, but doesn't actually suspend itself. You can use another new hook called use read query that's going to be responsible for reading the data and suspending if it's not ready yet. So I highly encourage you to go check out our documentation if you want to learn more about those two hooks.
And then looking to the future, we're already planning our next minor release with 3.9. We're very excited to work on a suspenseful version of use fragment. For those who love GraphQL, we love fragments and we want to make it part of our suspense story. And then also a lazy version of use background query. So you can get a function that you can call to start preloading data on some user interaction, like on click or on hover. So yeah, we're really excited about the future of Suspense and Apollo Client.
Yeah. So if you like what you saw here today, this is actually a repo that you can go run yourself, clone, and interact with. So you can find it here on our Apollo GraphQL org under the Spotify Showcase repo. We're going to use this as a learning tool, a teaching tool. Us as Apollo Client maintainers, we want to show off some best practices with Apollo Client and maybe some techniques that maybe you haven't seen before. Also, too, we want to use this as a tool for stress testing our own APIs. So as we build these new features and ideas, this gives us an area for us to really kind of iterate and figure out, because we think that figuring out how to build the best APIs means actually empathizing with our users and using it like we would a real user. So we're pretty excited about this. But with that, thanks for having us up here. We really appreciate it.
Thank you so much.